Oscars.
Okay, Oscars.
Yeah, what are you cheering for? I finally saw Nora.
Oh my God, what did you think?
I love Sean Baker. I think he can do better stuff than that.
Wow,
And he
I
has.
loved it.
I respect that.
The final scene is like the
I-
crazy. I mean,
I
I
loved
thought
the
about
final
it
scene.
for weeks afterwards.
I'm still thinking about it, but I think when I sat there, I was like, that was spontaneous. And the things that I love about Sean, I'm just going to give you a short version of my Letterboxd review. What I love about Sean Baker's filmmaking is
Oh my God,
feels...
wait, look at the time. It's time for Sound Politics.
Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann.
And we're...
Oh my God, you're stepping up my name.
We're turning our sights quickly, because we don't have much time, to Olympia this week to talk about the budget.
Not even enough time to introduce ourselves. Okay, so let's play a little game of which Washington am I talking about? There is a single party in control of the House, Senate, and executive branch. And the executive is leaning on his party to pass his budget priorities. And this is causing a little bit of strife. So, Scott, is this D.C. or Washington State?
Is there an option that doesn't get a bunch of people mad at me?
Yeah, no. See, you're always questioning the rules.
All of the above.
Ding, ding, ding. So in D.C., Republicans in the House just passed President Trump's preferred budget resolution, that one big, beautiful bill he was after that extends tax cuts from the first Trump administration to the tune of $4.5 trillion. And in order to get buy-in from budget hawks and to qualify for a process that only requires a simple majority to pass, they added about $2 trillion in federal spending cuts. That's expected to affect Medicaid. Of course, we have to see what happens in the Senate, but that's what's going on in D.C. this week.
Yeah, and we've been talking about federal stuff so much. We've got to turn to Olympia for this episode. As you said, Governor Ferguson has made some clear budget demands, maybe not as drastic as President Trump's, but some clear budget demands from Democrats in the Senate and the House. These include things like cutting agency budgets by 6% across the board. The Seattle Times called it a haircut, across the board haircut or something like that. He also said that he won't sign any budget that doesn't allocate $100 million to hiring new police officers.
Yeah, that $100 million for cops was one of his campaign promises. We heard again and again about public safety on the stump.
Yeah, right. And he's laying out the details on these cuts that he wants to make to the state government and the budget to fill a budget hole and also make room for that $100 million that we just talked about. As we're recording right now, his press conference is a couple hours off, but we're going to pop back in the studio after that speech to debrief.
Yeah. And I should say that not all Democrats agree with the governor's approach to leading with cuts. Legislative leaders have been looking at a number of revenue-focused ways to fill the budget gaps. So raising property taxes maybe, or a wealth tax.
Yeah, that's a 1% tax on assets above $100 million, originally proposed by former Governor Jay Inslee. Now Governor Ferguson is skeptical, to say the least.
And the Legislative Black Caucus said that they oppose spending $100 million on police recruitment without similar investments in social services.
I have to say, Libby, that when Democrats increased their majorities in both the House and the Senate this year, I did not expect to see this gulf, honestly, between them and the Democratic governor.
Gulf feels kind of strong to me. What about a ravine?
A gully, maybe.
Yeah, it's a Ferg gully. You're welcome. But yeah, here we are. We have, I should say, invited the governor to come on the show, and we are hoping to get that scheduled soon. Bob Ferguson for the pod.
Fingers crossed.
We have also invited Representative Kristine Reeves to talk with us. She represents Washington's 30th district and is the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus in Olympia. And she joins us now. Representative Reeves, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invite.
We'll get into the budget in just a moment. I want to start with a question about Washington's Legislative Black Caucus, which you lead. It's now the largest Black legislative caucus in the Western United States. There are 14 members after Natasha Hill got elected to the House in Spokane, Sean Scott in Seattle, and then Breonna Thomas was also appointed in Seattle last month. So now, I think you've talked about how there's less pressure on any one member of the caucus to represent, the entire Black electorate. I think it's really interesting that you have, like Sean Scott, I mentioned, is a defund the police, prison abolitionist. And then you also have a state patrol sergeant in Senator John Lovick. Does that make the caucus meetings interesting? Like, what's the vibe in the Black Caucus?
Yeah, what I would say is first and foremost, just like the general electorate, Black people are not a monolith, right? And we all come with our own experiences, our own lived journeys. And as you've just highlighted, what I actually think the Black Caucus in Washington does really well is serve as a representative sample of the larger electorate on all of the things that we care about. And so, yeah, of course, we're having really robust dialogue in our caucus about how to find a balanced path forward, particularly on the law enforcement proposal that the governor has put out, but on a variety of things. Like, how do we ensure, as we're talking about budget cuts, we're ensuring that we're protecting community in that process, that we're building community resilience. And that's not going to look the same for every community or every legislator. And so I just like to say, I think the Black Caucus is a really great representative sample of the larger electorate.
Representative Reeves, I want to talk about the big $12 billion budget shortfall that the state is facing. As you're in these negotiations, the governor has said he won't sign a budget that doesn't include $100 million for police. You have been critical of that. Tell us why.
Well, I think, what I would say is much like the larger electorate, people of color are actually people of the global majority. And here in Washington, I'll use my district as an example. My district is nearly 60% people of color. Look, I'm a pro law enforcement Black person. My brother has served 20 years in the military doing police enforcement. I understand the need, right, for an enforcement mechanism in community when things go wrong. What I also know is that in any institution, we can build cultures of bias. And unfortunately, in law enforcement, we have individuals, I won't say the community writ large, but we have individuals who utilize their role in law enforcement to perpetrate that bias. And it's really important to me as a mom of two young kids, of biracial kids, that we are fixing these systemic harms as in so much as we can. And I think this is a great opportunity to work collaboratively with the governor to ensure that folks understand that in so much as we're trying to create those investments, we're also trying to undo historic and systemic harms that have been perpetrated in particular industries like law enforcement.
And so you're asking, if I understand correctly, you're asking the governor, if you're going to put that $100 million for hiring more police, can you also do these other things? Can you talk about what you'd like to see in addition to that?
Yeah, I want to be really clear. The governor does not write the budget. The legislature writes the budget. So this is not a question of whether or not the governor is going to put $100 million into law enforcement. This is a question of if budget writers are going to try to partner with the governor to meet his said goal, we want to ensure that for every dollar that's being invested in law enforcement specifically, that we're investing $2 comparatively in community. Because what we also know is that disproportionately, when there's an increase in law enforcement activity or presence and a decrease in the social safety net, that has never fared well for Black people. And so, again, being a representative sample of the larger population, that if something is disproportionately impacting Black folks, it's going to disproportionately impact folks along that spectrum. And so the work we're doing with the governor's office and with our budget writers is to really say, if you're going to meet that $100 million goal that the governor has set out, we want to ensure that we're putting $2 to $1 into community. And for us in the Black Caucus, we'd like to see that money invested in the community reinvestment program. Specifically, we have a variety of other priorities, but we've basically said, if you're going to do $100 million for cops, we want $200 million for community reinvestment.
Well, yeah. I wanted to ask you about that community reinvestment fund, which I understand sort of funds things like prison reentry when folks are leaving prison and reentering society, grants to communities historically impacted by the war on drugs that you talked about. I am curious, though, like that money, there were $200 million was already given to that community reinvestment project in 2022. It's spent. I'm wondering how, in a budget shortfall that Libby mentioned, how are you going to get $100 million for police and $200 million for this project? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of room in the budget for a big investment like that.
Yeah, look, you guys are smart. You know that right now there is a lot of discussion about a $15 billion shortfall in our budget. And there are folks on both sides of that argument that will tell you that the government has overspent, we're bloated, and that we need to, look at cuts across the board. Our caucus has put out a website that highlights what a no revenue budget looks like, an all cuts budget looks like. And look, let's be really clear, that's going to be devastating. You then layer on top of that a federal administration that is freezing funds for things like Medicare and Medicaid. They're freezing funds for things. I chair the Ag and Natural Resources Committee. We're watching funds get frozen around programs like Meals on Wheels and senior feeding programs, food bank programs. So you add that additionality and these cuts will be devastating. So yes, of course, part of what we're talking about is revenue. I want to be really clear. The property tax that you're talking about is what we would refer to as intangible property. So for anybody listening, if you think we're proposing an additional property tax on your home or on your commercial real estate, that's just not the case. The conversation we're having is for millionaires and billionaires who are making tons of money in the stock market on intangible property. Every year you get a property tax notice if you own property here, and you have to pay a property tax on an annual basis. Well, to be fair, on intangible property, you're not paying a tax on that every year, and yet you're generating revenue from that. And we should be ensuring that the millionaires and billionaires in our society who are benefiting from the economic prosperity in Washington, from the hardworking taxpayers who are, getting up every day and going to work and helping these millionaires and billionaires make their money, we want to make sure that they're paying their fair share into this process. And so that property tax that folks are talking about is on an intangible property like stocks and bonds and other things. So just want to make sure that we're clear about that. But yeah, we're talking about all of these challenges, all of these options. And at some point at the end of the session, we'll find a path forward on what we think we have the votes for.
What about the idea of expanding the capital gains tax and lowering the threshold of where the tax kicks in? So right now it's at $262,000, for example. Would you support lowering that threshold?
It's definitely an option on the table. And I think part of the conversation that folks are having, there's a lot of discussion about where potential revenue is going to come from. And I think when we think about the things that we value in our state, budgets are a reflection of the things that we value. And for me, I'm really focused on looking at how we help ensure that the wealthiest 1% in our state are paying their fair share, to ensure that the 99% of us that are busting our butts going to work every day, can afford to live in a beautiful state like this. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of different options.
That's the capital gains tax. Rewinding just a little bit, you were talking about the wealth tax, right? Governor Ferguson has not been a fan of at least the wealth tax that Inslee, proposed last year. He said it's unreliable, untested. He obviously is more on the cuts side of this equation. What is the relationship like between, you all and the governor as you all hash out the budget for the next 2-year cycle? Like, where are you all going to meet in the middle, you think?
That's a great question. And I guess what I would say is, like all new relationships, right? You kind of go through these phases. You have your honeymoon phase. You kind of start getting into the storming phase, and then you get into the norming phase. I would say we've clearly scaled the honeymoon phase very, very quickly. And, we're having hard conversations about where the governor's values are, where our values are, and we're doing the work, right, in this relationship development process with a new governor, a fairly new body of legislators, to figure out where those values align, where we can agree on both cuts and revenue, and where we disagree. And it's really going to be in where we disagree, for example, the work that we're doing to build relationship with the governor around the Legislative Black Caucus, having a difference in opinion on how we should be funding public safety in our state, where we've just got to work through that. And our hope is that at the end of this session, we'll be squarely in the norming phase.
Representative Reeves, I'm hearing you say you're not in favor of an all cuts budget, that you do want to explore the revenue side of this equation. But, even Democrats who I think would be open to the idea of revenue are saying that there are certain things that will have to be squeezed here, that the belt tightening, will be, for example, the pre-K expansion. House Appropriations Chair Tim Ormsby said that the fiscal reality is that the legislature does need to delay expanding pre-K for low-income families. Last year, the program served about 16,000 families. That was set to go up, in the next fiscal year. How are you feeling about that at this point?
Well, Look, as a mom who's championing childcare for the last, nearly decade, I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. When I first came to the legislature, they were 2 and 4. I walked out of a daycare, twice a day, 5 times a week, just to be able to do this job. I fought really hard for those expansions. And so, yeah, of course, it's disappointing. But what I would also say, what's going to be more disappointing is our inability to make sure that kids have meals, at school. What's going to be more disappointing is telling folks that they can't have access to healthcare. And so, I would much rather delay the implementation of a program than make false promises to folks about the resources that we're able to give them, and, to then give them something that we're only going to have to kind of pull back. And so it's disappointing. And these are really hard decisions. But much like my husband and I, when we're at home and, our paycheck maybe isn't going as far as we'd like it to, or, some of these other things, we've got to have those tough conversations about, well, maybe you're not going to get to play sports this year because I don't have the funds to do that. Or maybe we're not going to be able to, go out to dinner, once a week, or whatever the thing is. For us, what I would tell folks is the decisions that we're making aren't about luxuries. The decisions we're making are going to be about life or death situations if we're not also having conversations about what revenue looks like.
We're speaking with you just about 2 hours before the governor is set to make some comments on the budget in an 11 a.m. press conference. As the head of the Legislative Black Caucus, you and your colleagues met with the governor late last month. Do you have any sense that he has listened to your arguments about adding these social service investments along with the hiring of more police officers that he's advocated for in this budget process?
I would say that the governor has been very considerate, and I really appreciate the role that his office has been playing in trying to meet us in the middle in this dialogue, because it's an incredibly important conversation for those of us in the Black community who have been disproportionately impacted by increased law enforcement. What I think, to answer the second part of your question, folks are going to hear, I think there are going to be folks who are pretty unhappy with some of the choices that are going to be made in the budget that gets rolled out this afternoon, as they were with Governor Inslee's budget proposal. These are really hard conversations we're having, and winners and losers are going to be identified in these proposals. And ultimately, the legislature is going to have to work collaboratively with the governor as the budget writers to navigate what gets in and what gets out.
We're gonna get tons of mileage out of that honeymoon storming phase.
Sorry, I'm so
metaphor.
sorry.
No, I love it.
I'm an organizational psychologist, right? And so there's a researcher that talks about team dynamics and team development. And one of the ways he frames it is that it's the honeymoon phase, and then it's like storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And I think that's how I'm thinking about this relationship with the governor. Is we got to legislative session and we were like in the honeymoon phase of like, yeah, we have a Democratic governor and it's going to be so great. And then he gave his inaugural speech. And I think a lot of us were like, oh, wow, well, that honeymoon phase ended pretty fast. And we're just doing the dance of figuring out, what this relationship looks like, where our values align, where we might have differences of opinions. And that's just how I think about it. So sorry if that was a random...
I love it. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up team dynamics, because before we go, I have a question that's more along the like team dynamics and vibes route, and less about, budget and money and numbers.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm sensing this vibe, and have for a while, in state politics. And I think, Governor Ferguson's promise to veto a budget that doesn't have his campaign promise of $100 million for police
that was a really bold throwdown.
Yeah, and that I think is a good example of this vibe I'm sensing. But also there's the rollback, in the legislature, right, of police accountability measures that were passed in the session after the nationwide protests over George Floyd's killing. And I think the vibe I'm sensing is, at least from your team, the dynamics on your team, it seems like the Democrats think voters are feeling the hangover from 2021 and 2022, and that voters didn't like what the Democrats tried to do in the immediate years following, and they're more moderate on policing, even in places like Seattle. Do you feel that vibe? Do you agree with it? Where do you think the voters are?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I would say is, and this is my personal opinion, and part of the reason that I came back to the legislature after what I lovingly refer to as my 2-year sabbatical is a recognition that I do think we have been moving away from electing, especially at the state level, electing previously elected leaders, right? So folks who have served on school boards or on city councils. And we've really gotten into this trend where we are electing post 2018 Donald Trump. We are electing a lot more kind of what I would say are like community organizers, activists, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think what you saw post 2018 really, and then you saw heightened in 2020 was really this uptick in activism. And what I tell folks is we recruit and train people to run for office based on a you versus me, us versus them mindset. What we don't do is then train you once you get elected on what good governance looks like. And good governance is how do we build a collective we, not a you versus me. And so I think what you're just seeing is a shift in folks really maintaining that you versus me mindset, us versus them, hero versus villain. And I do think that post 2020, as we got back into kind of the Biden cycle where things started to cool down a little bit, I think people felt like we were getting back into kind of a sense of, normalcy, if you will. I think you started to see more of the uptick in, local elected city councils, et cetera, and starting to get back to more of a, cool, my district feels this way about this thing. And while I personally may feel stronger about it, representing my district means that I got to be a little bit more focused on that majority middle rather than the extremes on either side.
Well, her district is in the areas of Federal Way, Des Moines, Auburn, Algona, Pacific, and Milton. She's Representative Kristine Reeves of Washington's 30th and the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus. Thank you so much for being here, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having these really important conversations. And I know they're not always easy, and hopefully we're not in the storming phase, but I think thanks for going along on the journey with us, because we've got to figure these relationships out in the best interest of the people of Washington State. So really appreciate the dialogue.
All right. As promised, we're in the performing phase, and we have done a time jump because Governor Bob Ferguson has just left the podium in Olympia, where he gave that big budget press conference, and he rolled out plans to save about $4 billion in the state budget. Scott Greenstone, you've been watching.
Hey.
I've been watching. What are the top lines that we heard from the governor today?
So I think first off, this seems like part one of what, who knows how many parts, long tweet thread, a budget thread, whatever you want to call it. This is a huge budget hole that the governor's trying to fill, right? $15 billion. This just begins to eat away at it. It's I got the sense that he's also, Ferguson, he's only been governor for about 6 weeks and he inherited that giant budget hole. So I'm getting the sense of like, this is a work in progress. He even said he was calling his director of the Office of Financial Management and saying last night, like, cut this, add this. So very TBD. And we still don't have a clear idea of how much we might lose from the federal government over, the Trump administration's really serious changes at the federal level. So, but obviously Ferguson's trying to influence the legislature to make these cuts because, as listeners should remember, Ferguson does not pass the budget.
Yeah.
He can veto it or parts of it, but the legislature writes it.
Right. So legislative leaders are working on their side of things. But what did you see in this Ferguson proposal? Like, what are the biggest budget reductions that stood out to you?
Yeah, big one. He thinks he can save maybe more than $300 million with furlough days for state workers. So requiring most state employees to take a furlough day 1 day a month for the next 2 years. As certain public employees will be exempt, including troopers, staff working in prisons and state hospitals. One other one that he described as particularly painful was food bank funding, right? During COVID, the federal government gave emergency grants to food banks. The state has backfilled those. He wants to end some of that funding.
That really stood out to me because he talked about his own time running a food bank right out of college. And that was more than $40 million in food bank cuts at a time when we're talking about increasing food prices. So that was he said it was a particularly tough decision to make.
Yeah, not easy. Other ones that he did not talk about too much is closing unused wards at Western State Hospital. And then like a lot of little, less painful than food bank funding, like budget dust stuff, like consolidating some office space and ending some leases at some unused warehouses and taking like a little over $1 million that the Forest Practices Board has for rulemaking but doesn't need anymore. Little administrative tweaks.
Yeah, kind of the low-hanging fruit, basically.
Sure. What stood out to you?
I was interested in the childcare funding savings. He's talking about $144 million that he's going to save, $144 million in that space. So the legislature, as I talked with Kristine Reeves about, has been investing in this big landmark goal of subsidizing pre-K for all low-income residents of Washington. It was 16,000 kids, 3 and 4-year-olds, getting that free preschool last year. And it sounds like the governor's recommending cuts that are more like a deferral. So waiting to expand the eligibility for subsidized pre-K. Eventually, it's supposed to cover more than 30,000 kids. So that is basically what we were expecting, because the House Appropriations Chair had already put forward a bill to delay that expansion until 2030, 31. Ferguson also said, though, he wants to slow down the rate increases for childcare centers that the state has been paying for. So like jobs that are difficult, to fill because the pay is so low and people don't stay in them. And so it's hard to expand childcare access in Washington state if nobody wants to work there. You're not getting paid enough.
And they were going to pay more, but
right.
now they're waiting.
Now they're talking about waiting. So that's another one of the savings. Scott, I know Ferguson's hoping to build some support for this because, as you say, he's not writing the budget. The legislature is.
Right.
In that spirit, he did emphasize a lot of stuff that he's not cutting. What did you hear?
Well, K-12, right? You mentioned that. Well, I guess you were talking about pre-K, but he also talked about, K-12 funding he does not want to cut.
So the K-12 not touching versus pre-K, yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for specifying that. He talked about public safety, although there's a little bit of a asterisk there because like Western State Hospital, a lot of people would say that's public safety related. Those are folks who aren't competent to stand trial or were found mentally, incompetent to stand trial. He also said, I'm not going to touch cash benefit assistance programs like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And he said, if you're a Washingtonian on Medicaid, you will not lose your state coverage. So those are some things.
Those are off the table, according to Ferguson.
Right.
What about taxes? That's the big question. We talked to Representative Reeves about her openness, for example, for the wealth tax.
Right.
A lot of Democratic leaders in the legislature say the same. What did Ferguson say about revenue, Scott?
Yes. Well, he's not into new taxes. I want to just, go to him on this. Here's what he said.
Look, we're not going to tax our way out of this thing. Not going to happen. $15 billion is a lot of money.
Yeah,
right.
So in his own words.
But, is he totally ruling it out? It kind of felt like it was let's wait and see.
Well, that's interesting. It's a divisive issue on the Democratic side. There are a lot of votes, as we've talked about on Sound Politics before. A lot of folks do want to include more taxes. I think that it's a rhetorical stance right now. You also have some folks like big funders, like Nick Hanauer, who are like, this is a boneheaded proposal. I think he called Inslee's
the
wealth
specific
tax
wealth tax, that Inslee had proposed. All right, so how is this all landing, Scott, like with the legislature or with people who would be touched by these cuts?
Right. So, Republicans seem, largely down with it, or at least one statement from Senator Chris Gildon seemed to signal largely happiness. Progressive, tax the rich. Democrats are not going to be so into it, I think. I talked to also Mike Yastrzemski, the president of the State Workers Union. He's also a psychiatric social worker at Western State Hospital. And, just to go deeper into those cuts there, the governor wants to do what are called warm closures there, that he wants to save about $90 million by shutting down, quote, unused wards. But Yastrzemski, who works there, said the state hospital has a backlog of people, found unfit to stand trial because of mental competency. Like he said, this morning I was there and every time a bed opens up, we're turning it over really fast so we can fill it quickly. He and other people too, Yastrzemski, kind of pointed back to the Great Recession when the state cut services for mentally ill people and said, that's why we're in a public safety crisis now. Here's what he told me.
We still have not recovered even from the cuts from 15 years ago, those austerity measures then, and yet talking about more cuts, you can't cut anymore. You can't get blood from a stone. There's nothing left to take.
That's a somewhat common refrain, from Democrats, right? Former Governor Jay Inslee said something like that in his final address. Like, those are dark days, and we don't want to return to those dark days.
That's why I wonder if, yes, we know this is the first round of cuts from Ferguson. Are we going to see him step by step maybe becoming more open to that idea of revenue. It really just depends, I think, on how these negotiations go in the legislature and, whether he is going to be changing his tune. I don't know.
Yeah.
You seem skeptical.
Well, I'm actually just not sure what's going on with Ferguson. Like, it's hard to tell what is this strategy. He has in his previous jobs, like when he was on King County Council, he called himself a fiscal hawk, I think. He was like a small government guy. So I think he does believe in efficiencies and all these things. But I also wonder, if some of it is like he doesn't want to talk about cuts to keep his spot at the negotiating table like really strong.
Yeah, he doesn't want to talk about revenue to keep his spot at the negotiating
I
table
mean,
really strong.
Right, he doesn't want to talk about taxes.
Yeah, and maybe it's like a last resort. But you brought up just the total unpredictability about what could be coming out of the federal government.
Right.
This big budget resolution that House Republicans just passed in D.C., including what most people looking at the numbers assume means billions in Medicaid cuts.
Yeah.
All of that will affect the states very seriously. Scott Greenstone will be following it all as it trickles down here in Washington.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Today's show was produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
In our performing era, I'm Libby Denkmann, and this show is only possible, just a reminder, with your support. Please consider a donation. There's a link in our show notes or at kuow.org/politics to give a little bit to help us keep this show going strong. Thank you.